Hi everybody, and welcome to the Chapter 14 lecture on the diversity of plants. We are going to be continuing in this lecture along our survey of the range of organisms that are found on planet Earth. In our last lecture, we discussed microscopic organisms and fungi, and now we are going to embark upon our exploration of plants. So what are some general characteristics of plants? Well, all plants are made of eukaryotic cells, which means that their cells are large and complex, containing a nucleus and other internal structures called organelles. All plants are also autotrophs, or in other words, producers, meaning that they obtain their energy by performing photosynthesis and use the energy of sunlight in order to build nutritional molecules for themselves. And all plants are related to each other and share a common ancestry. The fossil record indicates that plants evolved from an aquatic algae beginning approximately 500 million years ago. And this point is worth exploring further because we can understand the adaptations that land plants have if we look at aquatic plants and the differences between them. So, plants have come a long way from their evolutionary origins of organisms that live in an aquatic environment. There are a lot of challenges that land plants face that are not present if the plant was an aquatic plant. And for the most part, all of these relate to the presence of constant moisture for aquatic plants. And when we talk about aquatic plants, we're talking about things like seaweed. These are photosynthetic organisms that live underwater, and although they are similar to plants, they do not have some of the characteristics that true land plants have. For example, in aquatic plants, water is always available around the plant. So that is not a limiting factor for an aquatic plant, whereas a land plant has to pull water from the soil and, in some cases, retain it somehow and store it because it's not constantly available. Support is also a difference. Aquatic plants don't have to deal with the fact that they need something to keep them upright and supported because the buoyancy of the water is what supports the plant and allows it to remain upright. If you've been in a swimming pool, you've probably noticed that it's not as hard to stand up and remain upright in a swimming pool as it is on land because the water keeps you buoyant. But if land plants want to grow upright, they have to have stiff structures that allow them to stand up against the force of gravity and in the absence of water that could keep it buoyant. Anchorage is also an issue. So aquatic plants actually, believe it or not, do not have roots, and they attach themselves to whatever surface they are located on using a structure called a holdfast, which may superficially resemble a root system, but it's not actually like a root system at all. And in this image right here of this seaweed, the holdfast is this stringy part down here that is grabbing onto the rock, but it doesn't play a role in absorbing nutrition. Instead, it simply allows the seaweed to remain in one location. Plants anchor themselves differently by using a root system, which has a multifactorial purpose of both keeping the plant in a fixed location as well as helping it absorb nutrition. Because while aquatic plants can absorb their nutrition from the water that surrounds them directly, plants have to absorb their nutrition from the roots and then transport it up from the roots to the leaf structures where it can engage with the molecules that are involved in photosynthesis. So, as you can see, land plants face a lot more challenges than aquatic plants do. And over the evolutionary history of plants, they had to develop adaptations to overcome all of these challenges. So, here are some of the adaptations and the characteristics that land plants feature, which allow them to live on land. Unlike aquatic plants, land plants have a root system, which is defined as the below ground structure of the plant that absorbs water and minerals in the soil and also serves dually as a force that anchors the plant in a fixed location. Plants also have a vascular system. A vascular system is kind of like the circulatory system of the plant. It is a system of microscopic tubes that transports water, minerals, and sugars from the roots into other parts of the plant. Land plants need this, whereas aquatic plants don't, because aquatic plants, remember, absorb their nutrition from their immediate environment in the water, whereas plants absorb it from the soil and have to transport it all over the different parts of the plant. So they need this vascular system to do that. Land plants also have something called a cuticle. A cuticle is a waxy coating on the surface of the leaves and the stems, which is responsible for preventing water from evaporating out of the plant, which is a danger if it lives on land as opposed to in the water. And then finally, land plants have lignin, and lignin is a compound that can cause some parts of the plant, such as the stem, to become stiff and rigid, which allows them to remain upright against the force of gravity. Now, not every plant that lives on land has each one of these adaptations. There are different groups of plants which represent different stepping stones on the evolutionary path out of water and onto land. And we're going to talk about the different groups of plants that have evolved various combinations of these adaptations, all the way up to the most sophisticated type of land plants. Before we do that, though, before we start talking about these different groups of plants, let's talk a little bit about plant anatomy. Plants essentially need 4 things in order to function properly. They need water and minerals, which come from the soil, and they need light and CO2, both of which come from the atmosphere. There are 2 different components of a plant's anatomy. There's the root system and the shoot system. The root system is what we call the below-ground structures, which are dedicated to obtaining the water and the minerals, 1/2 of the equation. And the shoot system is the above-ground component that is dedicated to obtaining the light and the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If we take a closer look at the root system of a plant, and you looked at it under the microscope, you would actually be able to see that the roots are covered in these tiny little projections called root hairs, which are featured in this image right here. The root hairs make the roots much more efficient because they are like thousands of tiny little arms that are sticking off the surface of the root and absorbing water and nutrients in a much more efficient way than if those hairs were not present. If we take a closer look at the shoot system, shoot systems feature several different components. The main portion of the shoot system that runs from the ground up is called the stem. Coming off of the stem are branches, which feature leaves, and the branch points, where the branches emerge from the main stem, are called nodes. Regions in between the branches are called internodes, and the buds are the terms for the new growth of the plant, either of the stem in an upward direction or new branches coming off of the main stem. So now we've come to our first checkpoint of the lecture. Think about the part of the carrot that we do not eat. What part of the carrot's anatomy is this? And what role does it play for the living carrot? All right, so now is when we're going to get talking about the 4 major groups of plants, and we're going to start with the most evolutionarily primitive plants and move toward the most sophisticated ones. We're going to start with the non-vascular land plants, which are also known as bryophytes. Bryophytes are, as I said, the most evolutionarily primitive because they are most closely related to aquatic algae, and they share most of the characteristics with aquatic algae. When the very first land plants evolved, they probably were very similar to bryophytes. Bryophytes have 2 adaptations over aquatic algae. One of them is that cuticle, which helps prevent the loss of water through evaporation. And they also featured special structures that protected their pollen and their eggs from drying out. Because aquatic plants, when they reproduce, don't have to worry about their gametes drying out because their gametes are constantly bathed in water. But once plants made the move to land, this became a problem. So bryophytes had special structures that would prevent their reproductive cells from desiccating. Bryophytes, however, lacked lignin and a vascular system. So in other words, they didn't have that special compound that allows them to grow upright against the force of gravity. Nor did they have the plant circulatory system, which allows the plant to move and transport materials from one part of the plant to another. Therefore, bryophytes always grow in these low, dense mats because they can't stand upright, and they always grow in moist environments because they need to still absorb nutrition from their environment because they simply cannot transport it from a root system to a shoot system. They lack vascular tissue. So, these are not the sorts of plants that we would see growing in our immediate environment if we live in the Sonoran Desert. The next group of plants, which are a little bit more sophisticated, are the ferns, also known as the seedless vascular plants. Ferns possess two additional adaptations over the bryophytes. Ferns evolved lignin, which is the compound that allows them to grow straight and tall, as well as that vascular system, which allows them to transport the water and nutrients over long distances. However, ferns lack seeds, and so they still require a pretty wet environment in order for their pollen to fertilize their egg, because they do not have the protective layer or the protective structure of the seed to prevent it from drying out. That's the true power of the seed. Before we move on to the next group of plants, which do have seeds, let's take a look at vascular tissue in plants, because this is the first type of plant that we've seen that has a vascular system. Plant vascular tissue comes in two forms. There are two different types of tubes that run through the anatomy of a plant, and one of them is called xylem. Xylem are tubes composed of dead, hollowed out cells, and they are responsible for transporting water and minerals via this process called transpiration. Transpiration is the phenomenon by which, when water evaporates out of the leaf of the plant, that force of evaporation pulling the water out of the top of the plant pulls water out from the bottom of the plant, kind of like sucking on it or sucking on a straw would pull water from the bottom to the top, except it's not an actual sucking on a straw motion, it's evaporation that is causing the pull of the water from bottom to top. The other type of vascular tube that is found in plants is called phloem, and phloem consists of tubes that are made of living cells instead of dead hollowed out cells. And the phloem is responsible for transporting sugars from the source of the sugar to the sink of the sugar. The sugar source is another term for where the sugar is made, typically in the leaves. And the sink of the sugar is an area in the plant where the sugar ends up being stored in large quantities. So if you think about a fruit tree, for example, an apple would be a perfect example of a sugar sink. The sugars are made in the leaves of the tree and then transported through the phloem to become concentrated in the fruit. This brings us to our third group of plants, the vascular seeded plants, also known as the Gymnosperms. Gymnosperms were the first group of land plants to develop seeds, and a seed is a plant embryo that is packaged with its own food supply inside of a protective coating. This meant that a watery environment was not required for the reproduction of the plant because the seed was protected in its own little pod, which allowed it to essentially access new environments that were drier than the environments that could be accessed by bryophytes and ferns. And so, therefore, gymnosperms were able to spread easily across longer distances and larger areas compared to the other two groups of plants, which were more similar to aquatic plants. The sort of hallmark of gymnosperms is that although they lack flowers, they produce pollen and ovules, which are their eggs, inside of cones. So gymnosperms typically are these sorts of trees that you would see that have needles, such as pine trees, and ones that produce cones. That's how you recognize a gymnosperm. And finally, we arrive at our fourth type of plant, the angiosperms. Angiosperms are the most sophisticated type of land plant because they are the first group of plants to develop flowers. Flowers are actually a reproductive structure. They are a complex reproductive structure that develop into fruit and produce seeds. In terms of evolutionary history, angiosperms evolved the most recently. They are the youngest group of plants, but they are by far the most common and ubiquitous to be seen in all environments across the globe. Most of our food and other agricultural products can be traced back to a plant that is an angiosperm. And there's a huge variety of diversity in this group called angiosperms. There are over 250,000 different species of angiosperms that have been identified to date. Everything that you see on the slide right here is an angiosperm, from grasses to beans to cacti to palm trees. All of these things are flowering plants and therefore angiosperms. In fact, the group angiosperms is so big and so diverse that it warrants being divided into smaller groups. So there are actually two different subgroups in the larger group angiosperms. There are the monocots and the dicots. There are several features that allow you to distinguish between whether a flowering plant is a monocot or a dicot. A monocot is called a monocot because it grows with a single first leaf from the germinating plant seed. A single leaf sprouts from the seed, and therefore it is called a monocot, with mono meaning one. Monocots tend to have a fibrous root system, and their leaves tend to have parallel veins, meaning that the veins run in the same direction as each other rather than branching out. Their floral parts, meaning their petals and their anther, come in multiples of 3. So you can see that this flower right here is the flower of a monocot because it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 petals, which makes it a multiple of 3. Dicots, on the other hand, possess 2 first leaves that emerge from the germinating plant seed, which is why it's called a dicot, di meaning 2. Instead of having a fibrous root system, dicots contain one large taproot, which is a big central root structure that has smaller roots that emerge from its surface. They also have branching veins instead of parallel veins that run in one direction. And their floral parts come in multiples of 4 or 5. So this flower right here clearly belongs to a dicot because it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals associated with it. Now we're going to finish off this short and sweet lecture with a few checkpoints here to test your knowledge. Hornwort is a plant that grows in low, dense mats in wet environments. What type of plant out of the 4 categories that we discussed is hornwort? Next, name one difference between xylem and phloem. And then finally, based upon the images that you see here of marigold flowers, are marigolds monocots or dicots?